The first thing Kael'vith noticed when the bolt punched through her chest armor was how quiet everything became. It was not the silence of peace. It was not the silence of a battlefield after victory, when the smoke settled and the surviving warriors stood among the wreckage and allowed themselves, for exactly 3 measured breaths, to feel something that was not readiness. This was a different kind of quiet altogether. The specific, total silence that happened when the body's systems recognized catastrophic damage and began rerouting every available resource away from perception and toward the singular, desperate project of survival. Sounds that had been deafening a moment before, the shriek of swarm drones, the concussive crack of plasma exchange, the wet, terrible sounds that soldiers made when they stopped being soldiers and became simply meat in armor. All of it collapsed inward and was replaced by a thin, high ringing and the enormous, thunderous percussion of her own heartbeat. 2 heartbeats, technically. The primary driving hard behind her sternum. The secondary, lower in her abdomen, faster and more erratic, compensating. She had approximately 90 seconds before the secondary began to fail. Kael'vith hit the ground and the world lurched sideways, and she discovered, with the distant, almost academic clarity that catastrophic blood loss sometimes produced, that she was lying face down in vegetation. Soft vegetation. Green. Smelled medicinal, astringent and cool against the hot copper of her own blood, and it yielded under her weight in a way that told her the planet's soil was deep and saturated with organic material, the kind of ground that only formed after centuries of decomposition, layer upon layer of things that had lived and fallen and fed the next generation. An old world, then. A world that had been quietly going about the business of life for longer than most spacefaring civilizations had existed. It struck her as vaguely appropriate to die on something so ancient. She did not fight the ground. This was important, the first lesson in the Vethari warrior tradition that was not about striking or positioning or weapon maintenance, but about capitulation. Not the capitulation of surrender, which was dishonor, but the capitulation of reality, which was wisdom. Know the ground beneath you, the instructors had said when she was young enough to find the saying too philosophical to be useful. Know when it is the enemy and when it is the last thing that will ever hold you. She had understood it intellectually at 17. She understood it in the marrow of her bones now, at 39, with her face pressed into a planet that no one in the interstellar compact had thought was worth nomming. Her secondary eyelids, the inner membrane, the ones that filtered light and moisture and the kind of high-frequency radiation common in space engagement, slid shut first. That was involuntary, her body managing itself, pulling resources back. The world went amber and hazy through the membrane, the alien sky above her cycling from a pale gray toward something deeper and darker as whatever star this planet orbited drew itself downward toward the horizon. She made herself stay present for another moment longer. Kael'vith had watched soldiers panic in the dying. She had watched them rage against it, clawing at their wounds, screaming for people who were not there, making the blood loss worse with the frantic expenditure of energy on things that no longer mattered. She had watched some of them reach for their weapons at the last moment as if they could fight their way out of mortality the same way they had fought their way out of every ambush, every siege, every impossible position their commanders had placed them in across 22 years of service. It never worked. It was simply the organism refusing to accept the information the body was sending. She had made a private promise to herself years ago that she would not do that. Velthon, she thought, spreading her forefingers flat against the ground and pressing her palm into the warm, dark soil. The settling. The concept did not translate well into most languages. She knew this because she had tried over the years in various languages to explain it to soldiers from other species who had been assigned to her unit and found themselves confused by Vethari death culture. The closest approximation she had managed was acceptance, but that word was too passive, too gentle, too suggestive of resignation. Velthon was not resignation, it was acknowledgement. It was the warrior's final act of precision, the accurate, unflinching assessment of reality that had defined every other moment of her service, now turned inward toward the self and wielded with the same exactitude. This is the situation. This is what is true. This is what cannot be changed. She had fought the Devourer swarm for 6 rotations without sleep. She had killed 43 drones and 3 command units. She had held the secondary defensive line for 11 hours after the primary line collapsed, with 4 soldiers, and had bought enough time for the compact's orbital weapons platform to calculate its firing solution. She had watched Sergeant Vren die first, which was always the hardest because Vren had been with her the longest, 12 years. Vren had been there when she made lieutenant, and again when she made commander, and had met every promotion with the same steady, dark humor that was the Vethari soldier's primary coping mechanism for the absurdity of institutional advancement. They keep giving you more people to get killed, Vren had said when the last promotion came through, and Kael'vith had laughed despite herself because it was true. and because Vren was the only person she had ever permitted to say true things to her without flinching. She had watched Vren go down in the third rotation and had kept fighting. Then Asael, who was young and who had reminded Kael'thas of herself at 22, all sharp angles and controlled aggression, and the particular burning need to prove something that young soldiers carried like a second weapon. Asael had died covering a retreat that had already failed, which was perhaps the most soldier thing it was possible to do, and Kael'thas had filed that away somewhere deep and continued fighting. Then Merritt and Dawson in the same exchange, within 20 seconds of each other, which was the kind of thing that happened in heavy engagement, and which Kael'thas had trained herself not to process in the moment, because in the moment there was always something that needed doing and processing was a luxury reserved for afterwards. Afterwards had not come. The bolt that had taken her arrived in the sixth rotation, from a direction she had not expected because she was operating on the residue of adrenaline and combat compounds and 22 years of trained instinct rather than any functional version of conscious thought. It was a good shot, she acknowledged. Clean. Whoever, whatever, had programmed the firing algorithm for that particular drone class was not incompetent. She could respect that even now. She had fallen and she had not gotten up. And now the sky above this unremarkable, unnamed, uncatalogued planet was going dark, and the vegetation beneath her was soft, and she had done her accounting and found it sufficient. And the last thing she needed to do was close her primary eyes and complete the Velthon and allow her body to catch up to the conclusion her mind had already reached. She began to close them. She did not finish, because there was singing. It was not impressive singing. Kael'thas had heard impressive singing, the Vethari morning songs that military units performed after heavy losses, complex multi-part harmonics that could crack rock if performed by a full company, designed by a culture that believed sound could carry the dead somewhere that silence could not reach. She had heard the crystalline communication songs of the Luthon, which registered on instruments as well as ears and which, on 2 occasions she could recall, had made hardened combat veterans stop in the middle of a briefing and stare at nothing for several seconds with expressions they could not explain. She had heard 18 categories of sophisticated vocalization from species across the Compact's membership, and most of them shared certain qualities: intention, structure, the sense that the sound was being produced for something, directed toward some purpose or receiver. This was not that. This was the sound of a creature that had momentarily forgotten it was not alone in the universe. It wandered. It had no clear melodic line, taking detours and doubling back on itself with the breezy confidence of someone who had no intention of arriving anywhere in particular. There were no words she could parse, just a loose, unhurried thread of sound drifting through the darkening trees, rising when the creature encountered something that required physical effort, falling when the path was clear. It was the vocalization of an organism in a state of complete, unreflective ease with its own existence. Kael'thas had not heard that in 6 rotations. She had not, if she was being precise about it, heard it in considerably longer. Her warrior instinct did not wait for permission. Her primary eyes opened, overriding the Velthon with the same blunt efficiency that had kept her alive through 2 decades of situations where instinct was faster than intention, and she turned her head slowly, because turning it faster would have cost her the remaining 20 seconds of consciousness she was still operating on toward the tree line. The trees were unlike anything in the Compact's botanical catalogs that she could immediately identify. They were enormous in girth, with bark that had gone silver-gray with age, and they stood close enough together that the forest had a layered quality, the canopy so thick that even in the dying light almost no sky was visible through it. The undergrowth between the trunks was dense and green and chaotic, the kind of ecosystem that happened when nothing was managing it, when life was simply doing what life did when left to its own purposes, which was mostly to compete loudly and in all directions simultaneously. It was, she thought, extremely alive. Even the air above it seemed to be doing something, motes of material floating in the last amber shafts of light, alive in their own small and purposeless way. The singing got louder. Then something came through the tree line. Kael'thas's first, immediate professional assessment. Large. Not large in the way that swarm command units were large, not the engineered, threatening enormity of a thing designed to destroy, but large in the way that a species becomes large after a very long time of being an apex predator, large with the incidental authority of an organism that had never particularly needed to be small. Bipedal. 2 arms, 2 legs, an upright spine, a skull positioned at the top of the body in a configuration she recognized as common to visual primary species who had evolved in open environments where looking ahead and looking around were survival advantages. The skull had protrusions on either side, external auditory structures, slightly mobile, suggesting the species had once needed to triangulate sound sources in complex environments. Eyes forward-facing. Predator architecture. The creature was carrying an enormous bundle of gathered wood across one shoulder, balanced with the casual competence of something that had done this particular task so many times it had stopped being a task and become simply a movement, automatic and unremarkable. Its other hand held a device she didn't recognize, small, metallic, emitting a faint light, which it glanced at occasionally and then tucked away. It was dressed in layers. The outer layer was a rough, heavy material in a brown that matched the forest floor. The inner layers, visible at the collar and cuffs, were softer and lighter. The clothing was worn, repaired in several places, she noted, with competent but inelegant stitching that suggested someone who cared about function over appearance. The boots were heavy. The footfalls were heavy. It had not been trying to be quiet. It had not been trying because it had no idea she was there. The moment it cleared the tree line and the failing light fell on the ground ahead of it, it stopped. The wood bundle shifted on its shoulder. The creature adjusted its grip reflexively without taking its eyes off her. In the silence that followed, Kelvith catalogued several things with the systematic efficiency of a soldier who had learned to extract tactical information from extremely rapid observation. The creature's body had gone still, but not the stillness of predatory focus. It was a different quality of stillness, the kind that happened when a mind was processing something unexpected and all physical resources had been temporarily redirected toward evaluation rather than action. Its eyes were wide. The external auditory structures were oriented forward at maximum extension. Its free hand had come up in front of its own face with the fingers spread, covering the lower portion of its features, and it was emitting a new sound, not singing, not any vocalization she could categorize, something fragmented and rhythmic that kept repeating. She would learn later that it was saying, "Oh no, oh no, 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 okay, okay, don't move, you're okay, I'm okay, we're okay." The repetition of okay in particular would interest her later, when she had language enough to interrogate it, because it was clearly not a factual assessment. Things were, by any objective standard, extremely far from okay. She was dying on its forest floor. It had just encountered a species it had almost certainly never seen before. Nothing about the situation merited the word okay in any of the 18 languages she spoke. She would eventually conclude that humans used the word okay not as a description of reality, but as an instruction. Not a statement about how things were, but a directive about how things were going to be, issued to the universe with a confidence that was either extraordinary arrogance or extraordinary will, and she was honestly not certain which. The creature lowered the wood bundle from its shoulder with deliberate care, setting it on the ground without making a sudden movement. She noted that it was managing its own body language. It was not certain what she would respond to, and in the absence of certainty it was defaulting to slowness, to minimize threat signaling, to the behavioral vocabulary of a creature trying very hard not to startle something dangerous. Then it walked toward her. Not running, not cautiously, not the exaggerated, tiptoeing caution of something that was afraid and fighting the fear down, but with the direct, purposeful stride of something that had made a decision and was implementing it. 12 steps. It covered the distance between the tree line and her fallen body in 12 steps and crouched, and she looked up at it from the ground and it looked down at her, and for a moment neither of them did anything at all. Its face, she noted distantly, was doing extraordinary things. The musculature around its eyes and mouth was incredibly mobile, more mobile, she thought, than any species she had encountered, which used facial movement primarily for threat displays or mating signals. This creature's face seemed to be communicating something more complex than either of those things. There was distress in it, legible even across the barrier of species, a tension in the area around the eyes, a quality to the set of the mouth that she associated from evolutionary first principles with pain response. It was not in pain. The distress it was displaying appeared to be in response to her pain, which was a more sophisticated and troubling piece of information than she currently had the resources to analyze. Its hands came forward. Kelvith had sufficient consciousness remaining to form two thoughts. The first, if it touches the wound, I will die faster. The shrapnel is load-bearing if disturbed. The second, which arrived immediately after, I do not have the physical resources to prevent it. She tried anyway. She said, "Do not touch me," in Vethari, which was the most precise language she possessed, the language in which she thought and dreamed and issued orders, the language that felt most like the inside of her own head. The creature paused. She had its attention. She said, "Do not touch me," in Compact Standard, which was the trade and diplomatic language of 37 spacefaring species, and which any vessel-going entity with a translation matrix would recognize. The creature's auditory structures moved. It was listening, it did not understand. She said, "Do not touch me," in Shethon, which was the most widely distributed secondary language in the inner compact territories, the one most likely to appear in any civilization that had come into contact with the trading networks even at second or third hand. Nothing. She had 3 more languages. She did not have the blood pressure to use them. The creature reached out and pressed both hands bare, soft, without any protective covering, without any apparent awareness of what it was touching, flat against the hole in her chest. And Kelvith felt the pressure change and braced for the sickening cascade of failure that would follow the shrapnel displacement, and felt it stop. The hands were pressing around the wound, she realized, not into it. The creature was doing something with the fabric of its outer garment, pulling at it, she registered, tearing it free with a quick, decisive motion, and folding it and pressing it in a configuration that she recognized with bewildered clarity as a compression dressing. It knew about compression dressings. It knew or had guessed that pressure applied to the edges of the wound rather than its center would slow the blood loss without disturbing whatever was inside her. That was not obvious. That was not the instinctive response of most organisms, which tended toward either pressing directly on the wound, often catastrophically unhelpful, or retreating from the visible damage altogether. This was a specific, practiced understanding of injury management. Where had a creature from an uncatalogued, pre-contact planet learned that? She tried one final time to pull away from it. She got her forearm against the ground and pushed, and the effort cost her approximately 40% of her remaining consciousness, and accomplished nothing except informing her definitively that she did not currently have the physical resources to resist a creature this size, even if she had wanted to. The human leaned its weight into her. Not aggressively, nothing in its behavior read as aggressive, which was its own category of strange for a species she had assessed as predator architecture. It leaned in with the steady, immovable patience of something that had decided on a course of action and intended to see it through regardless of how many times the other party objected. Its voice was going again, the low, continuous murmur of sound that she could not decode, could not parse for content, could only receive as a texture of noise. Later she would know the words were, I've got you, stay with me, it's okay, I'm not going to leave, stay with me. But even without the words, even in the deepest dark of blood loss and exhaustion and the accumulated weight of 6 rotations of uninterrupted combat, something in the sound reached something that was not her soldier's training and not her tactical mind, and not the part of her that had spent 22 years building walls between herself and anything that might compromise her effectiveness in the field. Something that was simply a body, an organism, a creature that was badly hurt and alone and against all expectation, no longer quite as alone as it had been a few minutes ago. She closed her primary eyes. This time it was not Velthon. This time it was simply sleep. She drifted in and out of consciousness for a period she could not measure. There were fragments, impressions without chronology, arriving in no particular order and with no particular fidelity to reality. The sensation of movement, not her own movement, controlled and purposeful, but being moved, her weight redistributed and transported, which her body's deep instincts registered as threat before the surface of her mind could assess it and decide otherwise. Cold air, a lot of it pressing against the exposed surfaces of her face and the back of her hands, carrying smells that were so numerous and complex and strange that her olfactory system, which was designed for battlefield threat assessment and not ecological cataloging, simply gave up trying to categorize them and let them wash over her as undifferentiated sensation. Warmth coming later, sudden, structured warmth, the kind that radiated from a concentrated source and bounced off close surfaces to surround from multiple directions. Enclosed space, interior. The human's voice continuous. She registered it as a constant even when everything else phased in and out. It talked, she realized later, the way some people maintained a fire, not because the fire required conversation, but because the act of maintaining it required the maintainer to keep doing something, and talking was the something that came most naturally. It was talking to her and also possibly to itself, and also possibly to some third party not present. She could not have said with confidence which of these was primary. Pain arrived in the 4th interval of consciousness. Not the hot, immediate pain of the original injury, which was in some ways easier to manage because it was acute and therefore had clear neurological boundaries, but the deep, persistent ache of tissue beginning the slow process of attempting to knit itself back together, which was worse in a different way because it was unceasing and present in everything and impossible to locate precisely and therefore impossible to manage tactically. It was the body's way of announcing that it had decided to survive and was now devoting substantial resources to the project, and considered this announcement non-negotiable. She slept. She woke properly and fully to a smell. It arrived before her consciousness did, working its way through the lowest levels of her awareness the way significant sensory information did not as thought but as physical fact, already present and already affecting her before she had the cognitive resources to assess it. Warmth and complexity and something that triggered the hunger response in a way that made her suddenly, acutely aware that she had not eaten in at least 6 rotations, possibly longer. Her body had been too committed to the project of staying alive to waste resources on hunger signaling before now. And the hunger it was sending up now was making that deferred deficit loudly clear. She opened her eyes. Ceiling, low and rough-cut timber beams laid close together with what appeared to be some kind of sealant packed between them, biological material, dried and pale, functional workmanship. Not elegant but considered, the kind of work that was done by someone who understood what they were doing and cared about the result without being interested in the result as an aesthetic object. She catalogued the room the way she catalogued every unfamiliar space. Threat assessment first, spatial awareness second, resource identification third. Threats none immediately visible. One entry point, a heavy door across the room, closed. Two apertures in the wall that let in exterior light covered with a material that was transparent but thicker than simple glass, probably for thermal insulation. No swarm signatures. No electromagnetic signatures associated with weaponry she recognized. No sensory data suggesting imminent danger. Spatial awareness, small room, perhaps 4 meters by 6. Ceilings low enough that the human, if it was as tall as she remembered, would need to be mindful of the overhead beams. Stone floor covered in sections with rough textile. Stone fireplace set into one wall, the source of the warmth, fire burning steadily and recently tended, not yet in need of attention. Heavy furniture hand-built by the same practical craftsperson responsible for the ceiling. She was on a raised sleeping platform along one wall, covered with soft material that her battered body registered as unreasonably welcome. Someone had placed her on her back with her injured side appropriately supported. Someone had removed her outer armor plates. She looked down and confirmed this, finding herself in her underlayer only, and had done so without disturbing the wound. Her armor was stacked against the wall nearby, not discarded, placed with reasonable care. Resource identification. The smell intensified and her thinking short-circuited. She turned her head toward it, which cost her more than she expected, the wound pulling at the movement, reminding her of its position and its opinion of sudden motion, and found the source. The human was at the far end of the room, its back to her, standing in front of a cooking apparatus of a type she did not recognize but whose function was unmistakable. A heat source. A flat surface above it, a variety of containers, some active and steaming, some waiting. The human was moving among them with a pattern of behavior she had observed in field medics during downtime. Not the urgent, reactive movement of crisis management, but the steady, rhythmic movement of a person engaged in a practiced process that had been performed enough times to become automatic, where the hands knew what to do without requiring the full attention of the mind, and so the mind was somewhere else entirely, unhurried and unconcerned. It was still making sound, a different register now lower, more intermittent, less melodic than the forest singing, more like a running commentary than a song. It picked up a container, examined it, put it back, reached for something she couldn't see from her position and incorporated it into the substance in the primary vessel, leaned over the result and inhaled, then made a sound that clearly meant adequate and added something else. It had no idea she was watching. Kelvith had spent 22 years reading the body language of species she had never encountered before, most of them in situations where misreading was fatal. She had become very good at the practice of it, the identification of patterns that held across evolutionary lines, the behaviors that were specific to individual species or individuals, the difference between territorial displays and threat postures, and the varieties of social signaling that had no corollary in her own culture. She read the human, now the way she had read 1,000 unfamiliar organisms before it. What she read confounded her. The human was relaxed, not the performed relaxation of a creature attempting to signal safety to a threat. She knew that behavior, had used it herself, recognized the slight tension underneath the deliberate looseness. This was genuine. The human spine was curved in a way that was physically incompatible with readiness. Its head moved with the loose, following quality of an organism operating in an environment it understood completely, whose threat assessment systems had nothing to currently report and were therefore quiescent. Its shoulders were down. Even its breathing was different from what it had been in the forest, slower and deeper, and without the irregular rhythm that accompanied suppressed fear. It was comfortable. It had brought a heavily wounded alien warrior of unknown species, unknown capability and unknown intent into its home, and it was comfortable. Kelvith was trying to process this when she attempted to sit up, and the wound offered its assessment of that plan, and she made a sound that she would not describe as undignified but which was sharper than she intended. The human moved. It moved fast, faster than she had estimated, faster than the broad, unhurried body suggested was available to it. The speed not of panic but of well-conditioned reflex, the speed of a body that had trained some responses to act before the mind got involved. It turned and covered the distance across the room and was crouching beside her before she had fully processed that it was moving, and its face was doing the complex thing again, the extraordinary mobile signaling that she still could not entirely read, all of it oriented toward her, and specifically toward the expression of, she searched for the category, concern. Not alarm, not threat response, concern. It was concerned about her. It held up both hands with the palms facing her, a gesture she had already begun to tentatively catalog as the species' primary unmistakable signal for I am not going to harm you, hands open and raised, which had a cross-species logic she recognized even if the exact form was unfamiliar, and began producing a stream of vocalization in a low, steady register. She stared at it. It stared back. This close, in better light than the dying forest had offered, she could see its features with clarity. The face was softer than she had expected from something apex predator-shaped, the bone structure prominent, but with a layer of subcutaneous fat and musculature over it that gave it a rounded quality quite different from her own species' sharp-angled features. The eyes were a particular color she did not have a category for, somewhere between gray and green, and they moved constantly, rapidly, tracking her face in a scanning pattern that she recognized as information gathering. It was reading her face the same way she was reading its body, she realized, and it was doing so with a thoroughness that suggested whatever it was finding there mattered to it. Its skin was a deep, warm brown, and it had a great deal of dark hair on its head that was currently loose and somewhat disordered, as if it had been held back earlier and had partially escaped. There was hair also on the lower part of its face, not the full coverage of most species she had encountered with facial hair, but a short, dense growth that covered the jaw and upper lip in a pattern suggesting this was deliberate, or at least accepted. It was, she catalogued with detachment, within the aesthetic parameters that most sapient species found to constitute an acceptable conspecific. Not that this was relevant information. She pointed to herself and Calvith. The human stopped talking. Something in its face shifted, the concern didn't leave, but something else arrived beside it, something she catalogued tentatively as interest or possibly relief. It seemed to understand the structure of the gesture. A name, she was giving her name. It pointed to itself, Marcus. She repeated it internally. Marcus. 2 syllables, simple vowels, hard consonants, easier for her vocal apparatus than most human words would prove to be, though she didn't know that yet. Later she would learn that Marcus was not the human's full designation, that there was a family name attached, which had its own history and meaning, which the human had apparently decided was more information than was immediately necessary for 2 organisms who had not yet established whether they were going to manage a sustained exchange. She corrected herself. Marcus was evidently what he was called. He pointed to her, eyebrows raised, the paired supraorbital ridges arching toward the hairline in a gesture that she was already beginning to read as interrogative, and attempted to repeat what she had told him. What emerged was Calveths. The tonal division was wrong and the vowels were shaped by a vocal apparatus that produced sounds from a slightly different palate than her own, but the attempt was recognizable, which was more than she could say for most species' first efforts with Vethari phonemes. She corrected the tone. He tried again, closer. She corrected the second vowel. He tried a third time and produced something that was, charitably, within acceptable range. She did not tell him it was acceptable, but she did not correct him a 4th time. Something happened in his face when she stopped correcting him. The mobility of it, which had been carrying the particular taut quality of someone concentrating very hard, released slightly. Not a smile, she would learn his smiles later, which were larger and less complicated than this, but a small, subtle shift in the area around the eyes and mouth that registered as something private and genuine, not performed for her benefit but simply present. She looked away from it. He returned to the cooking apparatus. She watched him work. He brought her the liquid first. She understood the logic. Unknown species, uncertain digestive compatibility, uncertain physical state, start with the simplest possible thing and establish tolerance before introducing complexity. It was the correct sequence. She had used the same sequence herself when caring for injured soldiers from unfamiliar species in field conditions. And the fact that he had arrived at it, intuitively rather than through any training, she was aware of suggested something about the depth of his practical competence that she filed away for later analysis. The container was shallow and ceramic, hand-thrown, she noted, with the slight irregularities that distinguished made by hand from made by process, and the liquid it held was warm and carried a faint salinity in several organic compounds that her body's basic chemistry flagged as compatible. He set it on the surface beside her. He did not hand it to her. He put it within her reach and then took one step back and looked at her and waited. He was not going to make her take it. He was going to give her the choice. In 6 rotations of combat, the last decision she had made that wasn't tactical had been whether to sleep or not. Every moment before that, and for many months before the deployment, every moment had been shaped and directed and constrained by mission parameters, by command structures, by the internal logic of a conflict that had been ongoing for so long that it had ceased to be a situation and had become simply the shape of reality. You did not choose whether to fight. You chose only how. She picked up the container. The liquid was plain and warm and slightly salty and tasted of almost nothing, and she drank the entire thing without stopping. And when she lowered the container, he was already turning back toward the cooking apparatus. He was not going to make her perform gratitude either. She looked at the empty container in her hands for a moment. What passed between them for the rest of that evening was not, strictly speaking, conversation. It was more like the careful, methodical exchange of organisms learning each other's behavioral vocabulary. Not the vocabulary of language, which required a shared system, but the prelinguistic vocabulary of intent and response, of action and reaction, of the gradual, tentative construction of a grammar of interaction from scratch. It was the kind of communication she had done, rarely, in extreme field conditions with allied species whose translation matrices had failed or who had arrived at the engagement without one. It was slow and inexact and frequently interrupted by misreadings that required correction. It was also, she noted, the most concentrated act of mutual attention she had engaged in for a very long time, because the absence of words meant that every other signal became critical, and she found herself reading the human with a focus and specificity she rarely applied except in active engagement. He brought her food when the liquid was established as tolerable, not the complex layered dish he was preparing for himself. He set that aside, she noticed, but something simpler. Softened plant matter, primarily, some of it familiar to her from the Compact's agricultural catalogs and some of it entirely new in a quantity that was correct for recovery nutrition rather than satiation. He had thought about portion size. He had thought about composition. He had not simply handed her whatever was available and assumed it would suffice. She ate. He sat on the far side of the room and ate his own meal and did not stare at her, which she appreciated. He looked out the window. He looked at the fire. He occasionally looked at the small metallic device, which she now understood was a communication and information tool of some kind, though she could not determine the nature of the network it was connected to or what it was telling him. Once he said something to the device, brief and quiet, in a tone that she was beginning to be able to distinguish from the tone he used when addressing her, different cadence, different register, suggesting the mode of address for an unknown audience versus a known one. He was, she thought, a man with a rich and complicated interior landscape that he was not offering to her and not performing for her. He was simply present with her in his own space, going about the things he would go about regardless of her presence, making room for her without announcing that room was being made. It was the most disorienting thing anyone had done to her in recent memory. Later that night, when the fire had been built up again and the exterior light through the thick glazed windows had gone entirely dark, he showed her where she could find water if she needed it in the night. He demonstrated this by taking the ceramic container, filling it from a pipe that carried water directly to a stone basin running water, she noted, which implied either natural pressure or a pumping mechanism, and setting it within her reach. She watched his hands do this. They were not the hands of someone who had learned to do careful things recently. The competence was old, the efficiency was habitual. The calluses on the palms and the specific wear pattern on the fingertips told her about the texture of the work he did, about grip and tool and repetition. These hands had spent a very long time doing work that required both force and finesse, and they had developed accordingly. These hands had also removed shrapnel from her body. She had not asked him about that yet, she didn't have the language. But the question was there and she kept returning to it. How? How did a creature from an uncatalogued pre-contact world know where to cut, how to press, what to avoid? She had survived things that should have killed her before, and the math of this particular survival didn't add up, and she could not yet ask for an explanation. She was good at holding questions she couldn't yet answer. 22 years of service required that skill. He checked the fire one last time. She had begun to understand that he did this at regular intervals, not because the fire needed it, but because checking was a form of management that gave him something concrete to do with the part of his mind that was always running contingency assessments. And then he paused near her sleeping platform. His face was doing something she couldn't read. He said something in his own language, quietly. Then he seemed to decide that this had not communicated what he wanted it to and tried again, more slowly, as if slowing down might help despite the fundamental impossibility of comprehension she had already demonstrated. She looked at him. He pointed to himself, to the space near her. He made a gesture she catalogued tentatively as here or nearby. He pointed to her wound. Then he made a question with his eyebrows, that supraorbital movement she was already coming to read as the species' most legible interrogative signal. He was asking if it was all right if he stayed close, in case she needed something. She considered this for a longer moment than was probably necessary. Then she looked away from him toward the fire, which was the Vethari nonverbal equivalent of granted. He could not have known that, but he seemed to understand that she had not objected, which in his working vocabulary of her behavior was apparently sufficient, because he settled himself on the stone floor near the fireplace with his outer garment pulled around him and his eyes, eventually, closed. He had given her the sleeping platform and taken the floor. He was on the floor of his own home. Kelvith looked at the ceiling and listened to the fire and the quiet sounds of the forest through the thick-paned windows and the slow, steady breathing of the human who had found her dying and had not left. And she thought about Vren, who would have had something precise and dark and funny to say about this specific situation, and felt the loss of that acutely enough that it surprised her. Then she slept. And in the sleep there was no Velthon, no settling, no accounting. There was simply sleep and the warmth of the fire and outside, this old and unnamed world going quietly about its business in the dark. The second time Kelvith woke, she woke completely. Not the fragmented, unreliable surfacing of the previous times, the consciousness arriving in pieces, poorly assembled, unable to hold its own shape, but the clean, total wakefulness of a body that had made its decision about survival and was now committed to the project with everything it had. Her eyes opened and the room was there, fully present, every detail immediate and sharp, the way the world looked when the organism inhabiting it had decided to stay. She lay still for a full minute before she moved anything. This was habit. 22 years of waking in unfamiliar places, field camps, transport holds, borrowed quarters on Allied vessels, twice in the wreckage of things that had been operational before she fell asleep in them, had built the habit into something automatic, a protocol that ran before any other process could begin. Stillness first. Inventory second. The room before the self, always, because the room was what determined whether the self could afford to announce its consciousness to anyone who might be paying attention. She catalogued the room. It was different in daylight. The exterior light coming through the thick-paned windows was pale and cool and diffuse, the quality of light that arrived through heavy cloud cover, and it made the room look smaller and more detailed than it had by firelight. She could see the texture of everything, the rough-cut timber of the ceiling beams, worn smooth at the edges by years of something brushing past them. The stone of the walls, which were not natural stone but shaped and stacked, dry-laid without adhesive in places and mortared in others, suggesting repair and renovation over a long period rather than a single construction event. The floor where it was visible past the textile coverings was a pale gray stone worn concave in the traffic paths, which meant many feet over many years, which meant this building had history. The fire was low but not out. Someone had attended it in the night. She looked at the space near the fireplace where the human Marcus had settled himself on the floor. He was not there now. His outer garment was folded and placed on the stone with the methodical neatness of someone who had straightened it intentionally rather than left it where it fell. The stone beside it was cool to the eye. He had been gone long enough that the residual warmth of his body was no longer visible even as a difference in surface appearance. She registered his absence as information rather than concern. He was not in the room. He had left the fire tended and his garment folded, which read as planned departure rather than emergency. He would return. She attempted to sit up with more preparation than she had managed the previous time. The wound made its position known. She had expected this. The specific quality of the discomfort had changed overnight, less of the hot, acute signaling of fresh damage and more of the deep, persistent ache of tissue in active repair, which was painful in a different key but was also unambiguously a better sign than the alternative. She was healing. She would not heal quickly. Her species' healing rate was not exceptional, and the damage was extensive, and she was working from a nutritional deficit that would take time to correct, but the body's fundamental decision had been made and she was on the correct side of it. She got herself upright by degrees, stopping twice to let the wound recalibrate its complaints, and sat on the edge of the sleeping platform with her feet on the stone floor and assessed herself as a system. Primary heart, strong, regular, no concerning arrhythmia. Secondary heart, present and functional, elevated rate consistent with active healing demand. Blood pressure low end of acceptable, would improve with nutrition and hydration. Musculature compromised. The extended combat had consumed reserves that were not yet restored and the inactivity of recovery had added its own stiffness. She would need to manage this carefully. Too much movement too soon would compromise the wound. Too little movement for too long would compromise the musculature's ability to support the wound, which was its own form of the same problem. Cognition clear. This was the one she trusted most as an indicator of overall status. Her mind, when it was damaged, showed it early and specifically: concentration failing, pattern recognition slowing, the particular subtle wrongness of a brain that was not getting what it needed. Right now the mind was moving cleanly, taking in data, drawing inferences, filing things in the correct places. It was, she thought, possibly the clearest her mind had been in 6 rotations, which was its own commentary on the neurological cost of sustained high-intensity combat. She spent a moment simply being still in the data. She was alive. She had been alive before, after engagements that should have killed her, and the experience of finding herself still in possession of a functioning body was not precisely unfamiliar. But it had never stopped being strange. The strangeness was not distressing. She had long since made her peace with the unpredictability of survival. It was more like a specific variety of disorientation, the cognitive vertigo of a mind that had prepared one outcome and received another. Every time she survived something that should have ended her, there was a brief period of recalibration. Reality asserting itself against expectation, the world insisting on its own stubborn continuation. She had prepared to die on this planet. She had not died. She looked around the room again, slower this time, and let herself actually see it rather than merely assess it. There was a great deal to see, once she stopped looking for threats and started looking for meaning. The room was full of objects, and the objects told a story about the person who lived with them if you knew how to read the language of accumulated possessions. Kelvith had spent enough time in temporary and permanent quarters of soldiers across 18 years of active service to have developed that reading. Objects talked. Objects told you what a person valued, what they maintained, what they had kept so long it had passed from useful to necessary without use. Objects told you what a person was afraid of losing, which was often the most honest information available about who they were. Along the wall nearest the cooking apparatus there were shelves, hand-built like everything else in this room with the same practical craftsperson's aesthetic, absolutely functional, not decorative, but solid enough to last a generation without significant repair. The shelves held containers of varying sizes, most of them sealed, many of them labeled in a script she could not yet read. Food storage, she assessed, the layout suggested an organized system, a specific logic to what went where, items grouped by category or frequency of use. There was an abundance here that she recognized as intentional rather than incidental. Someone had prepared for periods of isolation or scarcity, had laid in supplies against those possibilities, had thought carefully about what was needed and in what quantity. Beside the shelves, hung on a series of hooks that had been hammered directly into the stone wall, were tools. The variety was instructive. She identified woodworking implements by shape and wear patterns, several types of cutting tool, a measuring device, something designed for controlled shaping. There were tools for working with textile needles and thicker implements for heavy material, with the specific staining on them that came from extended use in their intended function. There were tools whose purpose she could not determine from shape alone, which she filed under investigate later. Below the tools against the wall were the things that had been given the most protective positioning, closest to the interior, away from the windows in the driest and most structurally stable section of the wall. Books. A significant number of them bound in materials that showed varying degrees of age and use. Some of them had spines that showed the cracked, faded appearance of items that had been opened many times. Some looked newer. All of them had been shelved with their spines aligned, which was another piece of information. This was not a person for whom order was effort. Order was habit. On a smaller surface near the sleeping area, a table, the right height for items intended to be within reach from a prone position, there were 3 things placed with what she was beginning to recognize as the arrangement of objects that mattered personally rather than practically. A stone, smooth and dark, with no apparent function. A small object she could not identify, made of metal, very worn. A folded piece of material, soft and pale, with a pattern on it that was not random, geometric, deliberate. The kind of design that conveyed something cultural to someone who knew the code. She looked at these 3 things for a while. They were the kinds of objects that people carried from place to place not because they needed them but because they held something that could not be left behind. Every soldier she had ever commanded had them. The specific objects changed: a stone, a folded fabric, something metal and worn, but the category was constant. These were anchors. These were the objects against which a person triangulated their own position in time and identity. The physical evidence of continuities that would otherwise be abstract. Marcus had been somewhere before here. He had left things there that mattered or lost them or completed them. He had carried 3 of them forward. She was still looking at them when the door opened. He came in with the particular combination of cold air and movement that she was already cataloging as his entry signature. The cold air arrived first, a wash of it that carried fresh information about the exterior world, damp and vegetal, and overlaid with something she had not isolated yet. A faint mineral quality from the direction of the sound she had registered intermittently as water movement, a stream or river not far from the structure. Then the door closed and he was in the room and his eyes found her immediately, which told her he had been expecting her to still be lying down and was recalculating. He was carrying things. His outer garment was on, the same heavy brown material, now visibly damp along the shoulders and the forearms from whatever the weather was doing. In one arm he held a bundle of wood, the same action as when she had first seen him, the familiar motion settling his body into a configuration she was already learning to read as routine. In the other hand, he carried something that turned out, when he set everything down, to be a collection of plant material, gathered, not cultivated. The kind of thing that came from outside rather than from any internal storage, and a container that was sealed and cold to the touch. He looked at her for a moment. The assessment was quick and comprehensive, moving from her face to her posture to the position of her wound-side arm to the way she was distributing her weight on the sleeping platform, and she had the interesting experience of recognizing a medical evaluation being conducted by someone who was not a medical professional. The habits of attention without the formal framework, the practiced reading of physical state that came from necessity rather than training. He said something. His voice was different in the morning, slightly rougher, with a different quality to the lower register that she would eventually learn was standard acoustic difference between rested and recently woken vocal apparatus. He put the wood near the fireplace and the plant material and cold container near the cooking apparatus. Then he came to her not directly, not in a straight line, but in the slightly oblique approach she was beginning to understand was his default, as if he had decided that arriving from an angle rather than head-on was simply a more reasonable way to approach someone who was injured and possibly unpredictable, and crouched to look at her wound. He reached toward it and paused, looked at her. He was asking. She looked at the wound rather than at him, which was the closest she could manage to a nod without actually producing a gesture she was not certain would translate. He seemed to understand it, took it as permission, and began gently checking the dressing with hands that were cold from outside and careful from intention. Up close in the morning light, she watched his face while he worked. Concentration looked the same on humans as on Vethari, she noted. The slight forward incline of the head, the stilling of peripheral expression, the eyes moving over a very small field with intense focus. The hands moved differently from any medical professional she had encountered, no formal technique, no trained economy of movement, but with a quality of care that she recognized independent of technique. Care had a texture. It was present in how slowly something was handled, in where hands came to rest, in what was prioritized. This was not the efficient handling of a problem. This was someone being very careful with something that mattered to them. She was something that mattered to him. She filed this under anomalous and left it for later. He finished checking and sat back on his heels and said something, and his face arranged itself into a configuration that she had by now catalogued as positive assessment. The wound was not worse, possibly better. He seemed satisfied by this in the way that people were satisfied by things they had personally invested effort in, not the neutral satisfaction of a task completed, but something that had stakes in it. He stood and returned to the cooking apparatus. She watched him work. He moved through the process of preparing food the way she imagined he moved through most things, with a complete absorbed competence that did not perform itself. He was not demonstrating. He was not cooking for an audience. He was cooking because it was the time of day when food was prepared, and he was the person in the room who was capable of preparing it, and those two facts together were apparently sufficient reason. She had cooked across 22 years of service. Field conditions required it. Field conditions also ensured it was purely functional, the quickest path between raw material and adequate nutrition, with no consideration beyond those 2 points. She had understood abstractly that cooking was considered something more than a survival mechanism in many cultures, including some within the compact. She had never found the time or the reason to investigate the more than in practice. She was watching it now. The plant material he had brought in from outside joined things from the sealed containers on the shelf. Some of them dried, she noted. The kind of preservation technique common to cultures that moved through seasons of scarcity, concentrated flavor stored in diminished volume. He handled the dried material with a brief practiced preparation that she watched closely and partially understood. He handled the fresh material differently. Less pressure, more consideration. The kind of treatment that acknowledged something was less forgiving and required adjustment in response. There was a moment when he tasted something, made a sound of mild dissatisfaction, and added something from a small container near the heat source. Then tasted again, made the adequate sound, moved on. She did not know why she found this interesting. She found it interesting regardless. It occurred to her watching that she had not observed anyone engaged in a completely voluntary and peaceful activity for the entire duration of the deployment. Every action she had witnessed for 6 rotations had been contingent, done because it was necessary, because something else would happen if it was not done, because failure to do it had consequences that could not be accepted. The urgency of necessity had been the atmosphere, so constant it had become invisible. She had breathed it for so long she had stopped noticing she was breathing it. This man was cooking because he wanted to. Because it was morning and he was hungry and he lived here, and this was the thing he did. She understood suddenly why the sound of his singing in the forest had reached something below her tactical assessment and pulled her eyes open against her own intention. It was not that it was beautiful. It was that it was entirely, uncomplicatedly unnecessary. He had been walking through a forest at the end of the day, collecting wood because he needed wood, singing because the singing cost nothing and served nothing, and was done purely because the part of him that wanted to do it had met no opposition from the part of him that managed his behavior, and so it had simply happened. She could not remember the last time she had done anything that had simply happened. He brought her food, and more substantial than the previous evening, calibrated to what her recovery could manage. She appreciated the calibration without being able to articulate yet why she appreciated it. Only that it read as attentiveness, as ongoing observation, as someone who was paying attention to what she was telling him even when she wasn't saying anything, because her body was saying it and he was listening. He sat across the room on a low chair, eating his own meal. The chair had the particular worn quality of something that had accommodated the same body many thousands of times, the depression in the seat that held the specific shape of regular habitation, the slight backward lean that matched a preferred resting posture. He had been sitting in this chair, eating in this room, for a long time. He was comfortable in his life. She turned this observation over. Not comfortable in the way of someone who had never encountered hardship, she was already revising that assessment based on the evidence the room provided. The stored supplies against scarcity, the tools maintained past the point of beauty and into pure function, the repaired clothing, the building itself with its evidence of extended repair and renovation, which spoke of a person who stayed and maintained and invested in things that were difficult rather than trading them for easier alternatives. This was not a sheltered life. It was a life that had met hard things and decided to continue. But comfortable with itself, at ease with its own shape, content in the specific way that Calveth had observed in a relatively small number of individuals across 22 years, not because they had everything, not because nothing was difficult or painful or unresolved, but because they had found some correspondence between who they were and how they were living, and that correspondence was sufficient. She had met perhaps a dozen people in her career who had that quality. She had always noted them because they were unusual, and she had found herself thinking about them afterward, wondering what the specific mechanism was, what they had figured out that the rest of them were still working on. She was apparently going to have extended time to study the phenomenon up close. On the third day, she found the first piece of the answer she had been holding about the shrapnel. She had been watching his hands consistently, the way they moved, what they reached for intuitively, where they showed their training, and on the third day he produced a kit from a cabinet near the door, and she got a clear look at the contents while he was checking the dressing, and she understood. It was a medical kit, not a sophisticated one by compact standards, none of the equipment she recognized from military field medicine or the more advanced civilian medical practices she had encountered through allied species, but organized, clearly organized by someone who knew what each item was for and had placed it accordingly so that the most frequently needed things were most accessible and the more specialized things were behind them. The tools for wound management were well used, not new. The materials were of varying ages. He had done this before. Not necessarily on alien warriors, but on something, on people she thought, looking at the worn state of the implements that were used for the most careful and precise work, on people who needed careful and precise work. She looked at his hands again while he worked and revised her earlier reading of them. They were the hands of someone who had done careful things for a very long time. Not a soldier's hands, she knew soldiers' hands, knew the specific wear and damage and the way force work built certain muscles and wore certain surfaces. Not an artisan's hands either, though there was artisan work in them. Something that combined the two. Something that had held both tools and hurt people and had learned from the experience of both. She could not ask him about it yet. But she added it to the category of things she was going to ask when she had the language. Language arrived faster than she had expected. This surprised her because she was not a natural linguist. She was functional. The demands of her career had required her to achieve working proficiency in compact standard and 2 allied languages beyond her native Vethari, and she had done so through the systematic application of effort rather than any particular facility. Language had always felt to her like territory she moved through with a map, following routes, aware of the spaces between the roads. Marcus's language behaved differently. It was, she would later understand, a consequence of the way it was delivered. Most of the languages she had been learned through formal instruction, drills, pattern learning, the systematic presentation of vocabulary and structure in an educational context. Marcus did not teach her his language. He simply used it constantly, in full context, in real time, in conversation, or what served as conversation, without simplifying or slowing down more than was strictly necessary, trusting her to extract what she could from the surrounding information and gradually accumulate meaning. It was immersive in a way that formal instruction never quite achieved. By the end of the first week, she had a working catalog of the objects in the immediate environment, the common actions he performed in her presence, the basic interrogative and affirmative and negative sounds, and several phrases that she had heard often enough in consistent context to assign meaning to even without being able to parse their grammatical structure. "I've got you" was one of them. "It's okay" was another. "Stay with me" was a third. By the end of the second week, she had enough to attempt direct exchange. Not fluency, not even close, but the rough, effortful, frequently incorrect communication of two intelligences who had committed to mutual understanding and were willing to look foolish in pursuit of it. He was, she discovered, a remarkably patient communicator. Not patient in the way of someone performing patience, managing frustration, suppressing the visible symptoms of being hindered by communication difficulty, but genuinely patient in the way of someone for whom the slowness was not a cost but a condition, a feature of the situation that simply needed to be accommodated rather than overcome. When she used the wrong word, he did not correct her immediately. He worked with what she had given him until he understood what she meant, and then, if the wrong word was likely to cause significant confusion in other contexts, he gently offered the correct one, not as a correction but as an addition, as useful information she might want. She began slowly to stop performing competence she didn't have. This was harder than it should have been. In the second week, she learned about the shrapnel. She had managed by then a version of the question, not elegant, not in the precise terminology she would have preferred, but sufficient. She used the words she had for wound and inside, and how, and the gesture she had developed for the careful, specific act she had seen him perform on the night she arrived, and she put them in a sequence and looked at him. He understood the question. She could tell by the brief pause, the quality of attention he brought to it, the particular stillness of someone deciding how to answer rather than simply answering. He told her. The words came faster than she could fully track, and she had to reconstruct the meaning afterward from the pieces she had caught, asking for repetitions of the parts she had missed, and the full picture assembled itself slowly over the course of an hour rather than a single explanation. Before he had come here, he had been somewhere else. A place where the community was larger and the hardship was different, not the isolated hardship of living alone at the edge of settled land, but the collective hardship of a place where many people lived in conditions that made injury common and formal medical care inconsistent. He had learned in that place the things that were most often needed. Not as a medical professional, he was clear about that, surprisingly firm about the distinction between what he had learned and what trained professionals knew, but as a practical person in a practical situation, learning what was in front of him because people needed it, and because he was there. He had learned wound management, triage, the basics of surgical cleaning, the dangerous things, the things whose presence in a wound meant you couldn't simply close it, had to be dealt with first or you'd do more harm than good. He had learned by watching people who knew more than him, and then doing the things they taught him, and then watching what happened and adjusting. He had been wrong sometimes. This he said without emphasis, not confession, not the weighted self-flagellation she might have expected from someone reporting their mistakes, just information. He had gotten things wrong. He had updated his understanding. This was how learning worked in the domain of practical things. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about the Compact's field medical training, which was thorough and standardized and took 6 months for its most basic certification. She thought about the medical professionals she had worked with across 2 decades, their training, their equipment, their institutional support. She thought about the specific, intricate knowledge required to extract shrapnel from a Vethari chest cavity without triggering cardiac arrest, the anatomical specifics, the instrument angles, the pressure management. And she thought about what it meant that this man had arrived at something functionally equivalent through the process of being present in a difficult place and choosing to learn what was needed. She thought this is what humans do. She did not yet know if this was true of all humans or if Marcus was unusual even among his own species. She was working with a sample size of 1, which she would have failed a statistician for in any other context, but the thought was there and she did not dismiss it. She asked him why he had come here to this specific place alone. The pause before his answer was longer than the pauses she had catalogued as deciding how to explain something complex. This was a different kind of pause. She read it carefully as deciding whether and how much. He told her some of it. He had been in the larger place until he was not. Something had ended, she got a feeling for the shape of it without the specific content, a significant thing that had shifted the circumstances of his life enough that continuing as he had been was no longer the thing he was going to do. He had come here afterward. He had built some of what was here, repaired the rest, and stayed. He said this without self-pity, and without the particular deliberate brightness that people used to signal that they were fine about something they were not entirely fine about. He said it with the flat evenness of a person who had completed the processing of a thing and was now living with its outcome, which was different from happiness and different from unhappiness, and was perhaps just the steady ongoing state of a life that had been redirected and had found a new direction and was moving in it. She understood that state. She did not say so. But she looked at him in a way that was slightly different from how she had been looking at him before, and she thought he noticed, because something in his face adjusted very slightly in response. Not a smile, not exactly, but something in that territory. On the 14th day, she stood up. Not for long, not for a distance that would have impressed anyone. She stood and moved to the door and stood in the doorway and looked at the world outside, and the world outside was an immediate, overwhelming experience that she had not expected after the controlled interior of the room. Green, an extraordinary, aggressive, varied, layered green. Not the flat, uniform green of agricultural plots or cultivated spaces, but the chaotic, competing, unmanaged green of a functioning ecosystem, doing what it did with no consideration for aesthetics or order. Trees of multiple types pressed close together, their canopies layered so that the light came through in sections, mottled and shifting, entirely different from the steady quality of artificial lighting she had spent most of her recent years under. The ground between the trees was covered in material that moved slightly even without wind, the living material of a forest floor that was its own separate and busy system. Layers of things alive, and things dying, and things so far into decomposition that they had become indistinguishable from the soil beneath them. The air was cold and dense, and carried so much information that her respiratory system spent several seconds simply processing the input. Marcus was outside. She had not known this until she was in the doorway. He moved quietly in exterior spaces. She was learning more quietly than she would have expected from his size. He was working with wood, the activity she had observed in several variations since her arrival, splitting it, organizing it, carrying it. She watched him for a moment before he noticed her. When he did notice her, turning from whatever he was doing, following some peripheral signal, he went still. She had come to read his moments of stillness as assessment rather than threat or confusion. He was evaluating her, cataloging her physical state, running the same kind of rapid field medicine analysis she had identified earlier. He said something she caught enough to understand. You should be inside, too cold, too soon. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. He moved toward the building's exterior, collected something that was leaning against the wall she had not been able to see from inside and brought it to her. It was a garment. Heavy, larger than anything she had seen him wear, clearly not constructed for her species' proportions, but large enough that it could be configured to function as covering, which she understood was the intention. He offered it. She took it. He returned to his work. He did not tell her to go inside again. He did not monitor her from the corner of his eye in the way of someone waiting for her to fail and need intervention. He worked. She stood in the doorway and looked at the forest and breathed the cold, information-dense air, and felt the specific, quiet quality of a moment that asked nothing of her, made no demand, created no urgency, contained no threat that required assessment. She stood there for 20 minutes. Then she went inside. He came in 20 minutes after that and made the afternoon meal without commenting on what had happened, and she sat at the table for the first time rather than on the sleeping platform, because sitting at the table was a different thing, a more present and upright and their thing, and she was ready for it. He registered this without remark, put a container in front of her, sat across from her. They ate together. It was the first time she had sat across a table from another living creature in a context that was not a briefing, a negotiation, or an interrogation, in longer than she was comfortable calculating. The day she laughed was the 19th day. She had not been trying to laugh. She was not in general a person for whom laughter came easily or frequently, not because she lacked humor, which was a misunderstanding some people made about her, but because most of her humor was internal and dark and the kind that only emerged in circumstances of sufficient extremity and sufficient trust, neither of which she encountered in abundance. In the field, humor was a pressure valve. Off the field, it was a social mechanism that she had never particularly mastered, because she had spent very little time off the field. Marcus was telling her about something that had happened that morning outside, involving one of the other animals that apparently shared the general territory around the building. She had a partial vocabulary for the story, enough to catch the shape of it but not all the details, so she was supplementing with context and inference and the considerable information carried by his face and body, which were excellent narrators independent of language. The animal had been doing something it should not have been doing. He had discovered this belatedly. His response to the discovery had involved a sequence of events that became, in the telling, increasingly uncoordinated and undignified, escalating past anything that a reasonable assessment of the original situation should have required. And at some point, Marcus himself started laughing at his own story in the unself-conscious way of someone who genuinely found the memory funny rather than performing amusement for a listener. And he looked at her while he was laughing, the question in his face. Do you understand? Do you follow? And she was following. She had the shape of it, and the combination of the story's structure and the unself-conscious quality of his retelling, and the specific expression on his face at the moment of the most undignified part. She laughed. It surprised her. It surprised him too. His eyes went wide for a fraction of a second, the startlement of an unexpected thing. And then his face reorganized into something that was the largest and least complicated expression she had seen on it yet. Open and unguarded in a way that his face was not usually open, and he laughed more and she laughed more, and it was brief but it was real. Afterward she sat with the feeling of it. Laughter left a residue. She had not remembered that. It left the body slightly warmer, the breath slightly changed, the mind slightly reorganized, as if the physical act of it had rearranged something at a very low level, like a recalibration. She sat with the residue of it and looked at the fire and said nothing, and he said nothing either, but she was aware of him in her peripheral vision, working on something, and there was a quality to the room that had not been there before. She could not name it. She had a feeling she didn't have the Vethari word for it, let alone the human one. Something like company. Something like not comfort exactly, which implied a prior discomfort that was now resolved, more like the opposite of the specific weight of being entirely alone, which was its own category of thing she had been living inside for so long she had stopped feeling it as weight, and had begun to feel it simply as the correct density of existence. He told her about the communities. Not all at once, in pieces over several days, in the evenings when the work of the day was finished, and the fire was built up and they sat, by now in an arrangement that had become habitual. Him in his worn chair, her on a low seat she had migrated to from the sleeping platform as her recovery progressed, the fire between them and slightly to the side, the sound of the forest coming through the thick-paned windows in the particular muffled way of sounds that were present but contained. There were roughly 200 people in the settlement, half an hour's walk through the forest. He knew all of them. He knew their names and their situations and the specific varieties of difficulty each of them was navigating. Some of it practical, resource and shelter and weather, and the accumulated logistics of keeping a settlement functional, and some of it the other kind, the difficulties that lived inside people rather than outside them, which were in many ways harder to address and required a different set of tools entirely. He went to them regularly. He brought things when things were needed. He did the work he did, building, repairing, the physical maintenance of structures and objects that would otherwise deteriorate, and the people of the settlement gave him things in return, sometimes material, sometimes the kind of labor exchange that pre-industrial communities had always used as currency, sometimes simply the information that there was a problem that he might know how to address. She asked him, "Why do you live apart from them if you know them?" He took a while to answer. He said, "Some people are better neighbors at a distance." She considered this. She said, "You mean yourself?" He looked at her with an expression she had learned to catalog as "You are correct, and I would have preferred to avoid admitting it." Then he said, "I'm better at helping people than at being around them constantly." She understood this. She understood it in the specific way of someone who had also organized her life around the distinction between the people she worked for and the people she lived with, and had made choices that maximized the former at the cost of the latter, and had not fully interrogated whether those choices were what she wanted or simply what she had learned to do. She did not say any of this. But she looked at the fire and thought about it, and she thought he might be looking at the fire and thinking about it too, though she could not be certain because she was still learning his silences. On the 22nd day, the retrieval signal came. It arrived on the emergency frequency she had not known was still broadcasting, a low-energy emergency locator built into her underlayer armor, the kind of passive signal that required no active operation and ran on a power source designed to outlast the organism wearing it, intended specifically for the scenario in which the organism was incapacitated or dead, and the signal was doing the work of speaking for them. She had been dead as far as the compact was aware. The signal had been speaking for her corpse, broadcasting her position into the frequency range used by compact retrieval operations. Quiet and patient, and unreceived for 22 days while the nearest compact vessel was too far and too occupied with the aftermath of the swarm engagement to be listening. Now something was listening. She sat with the incoming retrieval signal for a long time. The room was quiet around her. Marcus was outside. Through the thick-paned windows she could see the particular slant of afternoon light that she had learned marked the last hours before he came in for the evening, and the forest was doing its incomprehensible, busy, completely indifferent version of existence in the middle distance, and the fire needed attending. She attended the fire. She sat down again. She thought about the compact, about the mission structure she had left behind or that had left her behind, which was perhaps the more accurate formulation. Her unit was gone. Her commanding officers would have filed the loss reports by now, processed the deaths, redistributed the operational resources. The work of cataloging endings that was always the administrative aftermath of heavy combat. They had cataloged her among the endings. She was not an ending. She looked at the room. She looked at the three objects on the table near the sleeping platform, the stone, the metal thing, the folded cloth. She looked at the worn chair. She looked at the shelf of books with their spines aligned. She looked at the tools on the wall and the containers in organized order and the ceramic vessel she now used for her own water and had been using long enough that it had become unremarkable, had ceased to be an alien object in an alien space, and had simply become the vessel she used. She began composing the response. She was still composing it, working through the careful architecture of what she needed to say to the compact and in what order and with what evidence when Marcus came in. He read the room the moment he entered it. She had noticed this about him. The way he came through the door and the room told him things before she said anything. The quality of her stillness informing him about the category of situation, and he paused with the wood bundle on his shoulder and looked at her. She said, "Something has found my signal, a retrieval." He set down the wood. He sat in his chair. He looked at her with the steadiness she had come to recognize as his fundamental mode, the basic quality of his attention, which was neither intrusive nor withholding, simply present, fully available, leaving the space for whatever came next to be whatever it was going to be. She said, "They will come, I will have to leave." He said, "I know." He had always known, she understood. It had not been a question of whether. She was a soldier, she had survived, the compact would come, she would return to the compact. This had been the structure of things from the beginning. He had known it the same way she had known it, and neither of them had said it, and here it was now said, and the room absorbed it with the same equanimity with which it seemed to absorb everything. She said, "I have to write a report." He said, "Take the time you need." She looked at him. He reached for the object he had been working on the previous evening, a piece of wood he was shaping with the particular small tool she had categorized as a finishing implement, and he began to work. She began to write. The report first, tactical, thorough, exactly what command needed, the kind of document she had written hundreds of times, the form so familiar that her mind moved through it efficiently and left the rest of her available for other things. The staging ground data, the drone configurations, the firing solution she had died providing, the information her unit had died collecting, she rendered it with precision. Then the other documents. The one that was not tactical, the one she spent longer on. She wrote about the soil that was warm and dark and alive under her hands. She wrote about the compression dressing and the shrapnel removal and the calibrated portion sizes and the liquid set within reach without instruction to take it. She wrote about the 200 people in the settlement who received practical help from a man who lived alone at the edge of the forest and who understood the difference between being useful and being present, and had arranged his life around that distinction with the clarity of someone who had paid close attention to his own nature and made peace with it. She wrote about watching someone sing because they wanted to in a forest, on a planet the compact had not thought worth looking at closely. She wrote what she had witnessed. It was, she thought, reading it back, the most precise document she had ever produced. She looked across the room at Marcus, bent over his work, and thought about the question she had been turning over since the first day she was conscious enough to turn anything over. What are humans? She did not have the full answer yet. But she had the beginning of it, and the beginning was this. They keep their hands warm on the same fire they use to cook your dinner. They read the room every time they enter it. They bring things that are needed before you know you need them. They sit with you in the silences that are too large to fill with words, and they do not try to fill them. They know you could kill them, and they hand you the ceramic vessel anyway because you were hurt and alone, and to them, those two things together are sufficient reason for everything else that follows. She closed the document. The fire needed attending again. She attended it. Outside, the forest went on being what it was: ancient and indifferent and entirely, stubbornly alive. And inside the room was warm, and Marcus was working, and the signal was going out. And somewhere out there, the compact was beginning to triangulate her position and send something toward her. She had a little time left. She looked at the room, at the books with their aligned spines, at the worn chair, at the stone and the metal thing and the folded cloth. She looked at the human across the fire, who had found her dying and had not left. She was going to need more words than she currently had, she thought, for what this was. She began quietly to learn more of them. The retrieval vessel did not come immediately. This was, in the calculus of compact operations, entirely expected. Kelvith understood the logistics without needing to be told them. A retrieval signal from a Class 4 per contact world in a sector that had just hosted a significant swarm engagement meant that whoever received the signal had to first confirm it was not a false positive from damaged equipment, then determine whether an asset recovery operation was worth the resources given the tactical situation, then request authorization through the appropriate command layers, each of which had its own queue and its own priority assessment and its own version of the calculation that weighed one soldier's life against competing operational demands. She had been on the other side of those calculations. She had made them herself once about other soldiers and had lived with the specific weight of them. She estimated 10 days, perhaps 12. She had that long. She was not certain what to do with that information, so she did what she had always done with time that had a known end. She used it. She began, in the first days after the signal was acknowledged and confirmed, by completing something she had been working toward since she first regained enough language to work toward anything: a systematic, methodical catalog of what she had observed. Not the official document. That was written, finalized, sent in compressed burst transmission to the compact frequency, and now sitting in some administrative queue awaiting processing. The catalog she was building now was different in character, personal in a way that official documents were not permitted to be, structured around questions rather than findings, organized by what she still did not understand rather than what she did. She had never kept a personal record during service. Most soldiers didn't. The demands of active deployment left neither time nor energy for documentation that wasn't tactically required, and the emotional cost of recording things while still living them was often too high to be worth paying voluntarily. You recorded what command needed and left the rest in the body somewhere, where it sat in storage without label or file structure and occasionally surfaced at inconvenient times with significant force. She was writing it now partly because she had time and partly because she was aware, with the specific clarity of someone who had recently been closer to death than usual, that she was going to leave this place with things she did not fully understand, and she wanted to leave with them understood, or as close to understood as she could manage in 10 days. She wrote in Vethari, which was the language her thinking actually ran in, and she wrote in the evenings, when Marcus had finished his work and was doing his own quiet things, and the room had settled into the version of itself that she had come to think of as its truest form: fire going, exterior light gone, the forest audible through the windows as a texture of sound rather than a specific noise. The first entry was about the compression dressing. Not because it was the most important thing. She was not certain yet what the most important thing was, but because it was the thing that had puzzled her longest, and that she had the most specific information about, and that seemed, the more she examined it, to contain something larger than itself. She wrote, "He is not a medical professional. He has no institutional training. He has no access to the resources that formal training provides, not the accumulated research, not the validated techniques, not the networks of expertise that compound individual knowledge into something larger. What he has is attention and time spent in situations where people needed things, and the decision to learn what was in front of him rather than defer to the absence of formal authority. He did not say, 'I am not qualified.' He said, 'This person is hurt and I am here.' The rest was logistics." She stopped writing and looked at what she had written. Then she wrote, "This is either a form of arrogance or a form of courage, and I am not certain the two things are always distinguishable from the outside." She thought about that. Then she added, "I think it might be a form of love. Imprecise word. Better, the behavioral expression of a commitment to the well-being of a specific other that is strong enough to override the self-protective instinct to defer responsibility to someone more qualified. He accepted the responsibility because he was present and because the alternative, doing nothing, waiting for someone more qualified who was not coming, was not a thing he was willing to do. This is not nothing. I have met generals who could not do it." She closed the record. She lay on the sleeping platform, which she was still using despite being capable of longer periods of upright activity, because the sleeping platform was where she had spent her first conscious hours in this room, and it carried, unreasonably, a quality of safety that she was not going to examine too closely. She thought about the entry. She thought about generals. She fell asleep. On the third day after the signal confirmation, Marcus took her to the settlement. This had been building for several days. She had been increasing her distance from the building gradually, first the doorway, then the exterior perimeter, then a short walk into the forest's edge that had turned back when the wound indicated its opinion. And Marcus had been observing this calibration with the attentiveness she had come to expect from him, not directing it, not restricting it, simply nodding where she was in the process and adjusting what he offered accordingly. He told her he was going to the settlement to deliver things. He said she could come if she wanted. He said this in the same tone he used to tell her that food was ready, information, not instruction, not invitation with expectation built into it. Come or don't, he was going regardless. She went. The walk was half an hour through the kind of forest she had been looking at through windows for 3 weeks, and experiencing it from inside rather than outside was a significant difference. The scale of the trees was different from within, larger, more immediate. The canopy above doing what canopies did when you were standing under them, which was to make the sky into something intermittent and negotiated rather than continuous and present. The undergrowth was more complex up close than it had looked from the doorway. Things lived in it that she had not been able to detect from distance, moving in the peripheral space of her vision, registering on her threat assessment systems, and then being released as non-threatening with a speed that told her how thoroughly the 6-rotation combat calibration of those systems was already beginning to recede. When she had first regained consciousness in this room, she had been registering the fire as a potential threat indicator. Now her threat assessment let the forest move around her without comment. This was either recovery or danger, depending on what the forest was. She had assessed the forest as non-threatening and was provisionally comfortable with that assessment. Marcus walked with a different quality of presence outdoors than he had indoors. Inside, he occupied space with consideration, was aware of her position, aware of the room's layout, moved in ways that did not crowd or corner. Outside, he moved with a kind of expansiveness that was not careless but was less managed, as if the exterior world gave him enough space that the management could relax. He was aware of the path and the terrain and the weight of the things he was carrying and apparently also of her. Because twice, he adjusted his pace without looking at her, in response to signals she had not been aware she was giving. And she noted this with the specific attention she had been giving to all evidence of perceptual accuracy in this person. He was perceptive. She kept recording evidence of this because it kept surprising her, and she kept being surprised by it because she had not expected it. And she had not expected it because she had arrived on this planet with the Compact's default assessment of per-contact worlds, which was primitive. A word that was technically a classification meaning not yet participating in interstellar civilization, but which carried in practice an enormous amount of assumption. She had used it herself without question for the entirety of her career. She was revising it now, not replacing it, but understanding it as the beginning of a description rather than the description itself. Pre-contact meant they had not been contacted. It did not mean they were not paying attention. The settlement was not what she had expected. She had extrapolated from Marcus's descriptions a community of roughly 200 people organized around the basic functions of survival in an environment that required active management, food production, shelter maintenance, the logistics of collective life without the technological infrastructure she was accustomed to. She had expected something that looked like need, like the visible evidence of constraint. What she found was something organized around living rather than merely surviving, and the distinction was more significant than she had anticipated. The structures were varied, different sizes and materials and states of completion, reflecting different histories, different priorities, different points in the long process of building and repairing and rebuilding that defined habitation in non-technological environments. Some of them were old. She could tell by the way the materials had settled into each other, the way vegetation had accommodated itself around the walls, the way the earth around certain doorways was worn with the particular concavity of many feet over many years. Others were clearly newer, built by people who were still learning, not yet confident, the evidence of that learning visible in the joints and the proportions. Between the structures there was organized space, not the rigid organization of planned settlements, not a grid or a formal street pattern, but something that had organized itself along the lines of actual use, the paths going where feet had repeatedly gone, the common spaces having accumulated around the points where people naturally converged. There was a well. There was a structure that appeared to serve some collective function. She saw people moving in and out of it with the purposeful ease of a place that served a regular need. There was a large covered space where several people were engaged in what she recognized as a coordination meeting of some kind, talking with the body language of people who were both familiar with each other and engaged in active problem-solving. People looked at her. This was expected. She was a significant visual deviation from anything they had encountered before, and visual novelty triggered attention in most social species. It was the basis of threat detection, the neurological system alerting the conscious mind to information that did not match the predicted pattern of the environment. They looked at her the way people looked at things they were trying to assess. She was accustomed to being looked at. In military contexts, being looked at was usually a prelude to something: threat assessment, status measurement, the social negotiation of hierarchies. She was practiced at meeting it with the controlled stillness that returned no information, gave no signal that could be used, projected neither aggression nor submission. What the settlement's people did with their looking after the initial assessment was mostly nod, continue with what they were doing, occasionally approach Marcus to exchange words while glancing at her with curiosity. Not threat response, not territorial display. Curiosity. One of them, a woman of considerable age, with the kind of face that had moved through so many expressions over so many years that it had settled into a permanent state of interested attention, came to look at her more closely. She said something to Marcus. Marcus said something back. The old woman looked at Kelvith with eyes that were doing exactly what Kelvith's own eyes did when she was reading a situation, moving systematically, not missing things, drawing inferences. Then she said something directly to Kelvith, in a tone that Kelvith's 3 weeks of exposure to Marcus's voice had given her enough calibration to read as, "Welcome, and I am asking if you are well." Kelvith said in the human's language with the care of someone operating at the edge of their vocabulary, "Well, getting better." The old woman's face did a thing that Kelvith was now good enough at reading to identify correctly: genuine, uncomplicated pleasure. Not the performed pleasure of social protocol, the smile that was also a signal, but the simple, unguarded pleasure of an organism encountering something that delighted it. She said something to Marcus that made him make the sound she had catalogued as mild embarrassment combined with acknowledgement of accuracy. She would learn later, when her vocabulary was large enough to ask, that the old woman had said, "She has good eyes. People with good eyes find each other." Marcus was different in the settlement than he was at home. She had expected this. People were different in their social contexts than in their solitary ones, the self adapting its presentation to the demands and expectations of the environment, but the specific quality of the difference was informative. He was warmer, not that he was cold at home. She would not have described him as cold at any point, warmth being perhaps the most consistent quality she had observed in him, present even when he was quiet or concentrated or visibly processing something difficult. But at home the warmth was interior, not on display, running as background rather than foreground. In the settlement it moved to the front. He talked to people with the ease of long familiarity, and something she could only call affection, not the performed affection of social obligation but the real article. Present in the way he positioned his body, in the eye contact he maintained, in the particular quality of his listening, which was the same total, attending listening she had been on the receiving end of for 3 weeks. He was known here. Known in the specific way that meant people had history with him, had accumulated enough shared experience to have developed expectations, had found those expectations met often enough that they now assumed a fundamental reliability that freed them to talk to him without the energy expenditure of social negotiation. She watched a man of about Marcus's age stop him in the path and talk for several minutes about a problem with a structure on the settlement's western edge, pointing and describing. And Marcus listened with the focused attention that meant he was actually thinking about the problem rather than waiting for the talking to be over. And then he said something specific and practical that made the other man nod in the way of someone who has been given genuinely useful information. Then Marcus asked something, and the tone shifted, and the other man answered in a way that was slower and more considered. And Marcus listened to that too, with the different quality of listening he used when the content was not practical but personal, the stillness deeper, the face more open, not analyzing but simply receiving. He asked people how they were, and he meant it. She had been around military command structures for her entire adult life, and one of the defining features of those structures was the formalized version of this, the welfare check, the morale assessment, the leadership obligation to be aware of the state of your people. She had done it herself many times with many soldiers. She had meant it too, or had meant it as much as the structure allowed, which was not entirely, because the structure required you to do something with the information you received, to assess it for operational impact, to weigh the person's well-being against the requirements of the mission. And that weighing, however careful, however sincere, changed the nature of the asking. Marcus was not weighing anything. He asked because he wanted to know. The knowing was the point. There was nothing he needed to do with the information except have it carry it in the part of him that held the state of the people he cared about, update the picture, file it under the ongoing project of knowing these particular people. This was, she thought, either very simple or very sophisticated, and she was not entirely sure the two things were different. A child found her. This was perhaps inevitable. Children were, in her experience of the several species she had encountered that produced them, essentially incapable of the restraint that adults applied to encounters with novel and potentially dangerous things, because the developmental stage at which children operated had not yet sufficiently acquired either the knowledge of what was dangerous or the social understanding of which approaches were appropriate. They came at things directly, guided by curiosity and the not yet encoded assumption that the world was fundamentally safe, which was either a biological optimism or the product of sufficient early experience to have established a baseline of things I approach usually turn out okay. This one was small, she estimated perhaps a third of Marcus's height. With the disproportionate feature distribution of juvenile humans, the features not yet settled into their adult arrangement. It had found her at the edge of a cleared space where she had positioned herself to observe the settlement's activities without being in the middle of them, which was how she preferred to observe things generally. It walked up to her and stopped at a distance that was close enough to communicate absence of fear and far enough to retain the option of rapid retreat if the assessment changed, which she recognized as the correct tactical positioning for an information-gathering approach to an unknown variable. Then it looked at her with the specific quality of attention that she was coming to understand was characteristic of the species at every developmental stage, total, direct, assessing without agenda. It said something. She had enough vocabulary to catch approximately half of it. The half she caught was, your face and lines and do they hurt? It was asking about the dermal patterns. Vethari dermis carried markings that in the species' evolutionary origin had been camouflage patterns, but had over the course of several thousand years of civilizational development become individualized, each pattern unique. The way fingerprints were unique but more visible and more complex. Military service added additional marking, formal unit insignia applied by process, standardized, sitting over the individual pattern in a visual record of service history that any Vethari could read at a glance. Kelvith carried 22 years of that record on her face and neck and the backs of her hands, and the child had apparently found it the most interesting thing about her. She said carefully, no, not hurt. They are, she searched her vocabulary story. The child looked at the markings and then at her face, and then at the markings again, in the way of someone storing an image for later consideration. It said like a picture. She considered this. Yes, she said like a picture. The child reached out one hand toward her face, and then stopped and looked at her with the eyebrow question that was apparently a universal feature of the species regardless of developmental stage, may I? She looked at the small hand. She thought about Vren, who had had a daughter. She had met the daughter once at a ceremony. The daughter had been small and had looked at Kelvith's markings with the same expression as this child, though she had been old enough to know not to reach toward a stranger's face. She turned her head slightly, angling the most visible section of her marking toward the child's waiting hand. The small fingers touched her cheekbone, very lightly tracing the edge of one of the oldest markings. The one she had received at 20, the first unit assignment, worn smooth by time and familiarity into the background of her skin. The child said something she didn't fully catch and withdrew the hand and ran away across the cleared space toward a larger human who was watching from a distance with an expression Kelvith was now able to read as cautious, but not about to intervene. She watched the child go. She stood in the quiet of the clearing for a moment, her hand resting at her side, and looked at the settlement's activities going on around her, the ordinary, continuous, purposeful work of a community being itself, and felt something she could not immediately name. Later, she would write about it in her record, and what she wrote was, there are species in the compact that have been spacefaring for 800 years and have not managed to teach their children that reaching toward a stranger's face is acceptable. This child had no information about whether I was dangerous. It reached anyway. I think this tells me something about what they teach their children that I do not have the translation for yet, but the shape of it is, assume good intent until the evidence suggests otherwise. Keep the assumption until you have specific reason to revise it. Don't let the fear of what might be true prevent you from finding out what actually is. She put the record away. She found Marcus and told him she was ready to walk back. He looked at her face for a moment, reading it the way he read rooms. He said, we can stay longer if you want. She said, I have enough for today. He understood this was not a complaint because he had been paying attention. They walked back. She started learning things deliberately after the settlement visit. Not just the language that was already underway and proceeding at the rate that 3 weeks of immersive exposure produced, which was faster than she had expected and slower than she wanted, which was the normal state of language acquisition for someone too old to acquire it effortlessly but too stubborn to be limited by inconvenience. Beyond the language, she started asking the questions she had been holding. She asked about the medical kits. He told her more than she had gotten before this time because she had more language and because she thought some time had passed and the distance that time created had made the telling less costly. He had been in the larger place, one of the people who handled what needed handling when no one more qualified was available. A community of limited resources, significant distance from formal medical institutions, a population that had enough collective knowledge to address certain situations and not others, and the particular human response to that gap, which was, apparently, to identify someone willing to learn and point problems in their direction. He had not chosen it, it had accumulated around him. She asked, "Did you want to stop?" He was quiet for a while. He said sometimes, wanting to stop and not stopping are different things. She had known this, but she had known it about military service, about the commitment soldiers made to something outside themselves, about the specific discipline of continuing in the face of the desire to stop. She had not known it applied in this context. A man with no contract, no command structure, no institutional obligation, no consequence for refusal except the consequence of having refused, which was not external punishment but internal, the specific weight of knowing you could have helped and chose not to. She asked, "Why didn't you stop?" He looked at the fire. He said, "Because someone had to, and I was there." This was not a heroic answer. It did not present itself as heroic, and she was quite certain he did not experience it as heroic. It was the answer of someone describing a logical sequence. A need existed, proximity was established, therefore action followed. The same logic that had brought him across the forest floor to her. The same logic that built itself into everything she had observed him do in the settlement. She wrote about this in her record that night at length. She wrote, "He does not think of himself as exceptional. This is partly humility and partly accuracy. He has met his own failures, he knows his limits, he does not have the self-concept of a hero because he has been present at too many of his own incompetencies to maintain it. But he also does not think of the work as exceptional. He thinks of it as what you do when you are present and someone needs something. The exceptionalism is not in him, it is in the decision not to look away. He has made that decision so consistently and for so long that he no longer experiences it as a decision. It is simply how he is oriented in the world." She stopped writing and looked at the fire. "I am trying to think of the last time I acted without institutional authority behind me, without orders, without mission parameters, without the structure of command deciding what the right thing to do was and my job being to execute it. I am trying to think of the last time I looked at a situation and made the entire judgment myself, from scratch, with only my own assessment of what mattered." She sat with this for a long time. He does it every day. He has been doing it every day for years. The entire infrastructure of his life is built on his own judgment about what is needed and what is right, checked against nothing except the evidence of outcomes and the feedback of the people around him. There is no external validator. There is no appeals process. There is no institutional sanction waiting to tell him he got it right. And yet, she looked around the room, at the organized shelves and the maintained tools and the sleeping platform that was not hers but had been made available to her without negotiation. At the stack of her armor against the wall, tended carefully, touched only as necessary. And yet the work is good, and the people are helped, and the child reaches toward the face of a stranger, and is not afraid, and a dying alien warrior opens her eyes when she intended to close them forever, because something found her worth finding. She closed the record. The days had a rhythm now that she had stopped fighting. She had spent the first week in a state of covert resistance to the shape of her recovery. The way it required slowness, required patience, required the suspension of the drive toward full operational capability that had been the governing value of her adult life. Soldiers healed fast or they didn't heal. That was the operational reality. The time available for recovery in field conditions was always less than the time actually required. And so soldiers learned to compress their healing, to perform readiness earlier than it was true, to absorb the ongoing cost of incomplete recovery into the background noise of their function and keep moving. She had been trying to do that here. Marcus had not argued with her about it. He had not told her she was pushing too hard or that she needed to rest. What he had done was create conditions in which resting was the most natural and available thing, and then declined to be available for activities that would have required her to perform beyond her actual capacity. She had not identified this as a strategy for several days. By the time she identified it, she was also sufficiently recovered to recognize that it had been the correct approach, which made arguing with it retroactively pointless. Now she moved through the days with the rhythm he had established and that she had eventually adopted, working within her capacity, not beyond it, eating when food was prepared and it was time, sleeping when the body indicated sleep was needed rather than when the schedule permitted it. These were not complex principles. She had known them intellectually for her entire career. She had applied them to the soldiers under her command with some consistency. She had not applied them to herself. She was applying them now. The wound was closing. She could feel the difference day by day, the specific quality of the discomfort changing, moving through the stages of repair with the reliable if nonlinear progress that characterized genuine healing rather than suppressed injury. The secondary heart had steadied. The blood pressure was approaching normal. She could walk for an hour without managing the wound's objections at every step. She had begun to do forms, the slow, precise movement sequence that Vethari warriors used for both physical maintenance and meditative practice, modified for the wound's current limitations, but recognizably the forms, her body finding its way back to something it knew. Marcus watched her do the forms once from across the room, with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he was learning from observation rather than instruction. He asked her what they were. She explained imperfectly with the vocabulary she had. He asked if he could watch. She looked at him. She did the forms again, slower, while he watched. He said, "That is very beautiful." She continued the forms and said nothing, but the thing happened again, the thing that had happened when he had attempted her name and she had found herself correcting his pronunciation rather than ignoring it. The thing that had happened when the child touched her cheekbone, the almost imperceptible internal shift. The thing she did not have the Vethari word for, which she had been circling for weeks without being able to land on. She wrote about it that evening. She wrote, "I have been trying to identify what I feel when he pays attention to something I am doing. It is not the response to being observed tactically. That produces alertness, the raising of defenses, the automatic assessment of what the observer might do with the information. It is not the response to being observed admiringly in the social sense. I know that response, it produces discomfort, a desire to qualify or redirect. This is different. This is closer to what I feel when something I have done well is accurately assessed by someone whose assessment I trust. Recognition, the specific quality of being seen by someone who is actually looking." She stopped writing. "I trust his assessment." She sat with this. "I trust his assessment of things he has no training to assess. I trust his read of the room. I trust his read of the wound. I trust his read of the settlement and the people in it and the space between the buildings and the quality of the light through the windows in the afternoon. I have been watching him be right about things consistently for weeks, and the mechanism of his accuracy is attention, the same total non-performative attention he brings to everything, and I have decided without formally deciding it that attention at that level in that quality is a form of expertise I recognize even when it arrives without credentials." She wrote, "This is also what I need to include in the petition. This is the thing that the Compact's classification system has no category for, not technology, not formal institutional knowledge, not the measurable indicators of spacefaring readiness. This, a species that has developed or maintained or perhaps never lost the ability to simply pay attention, to be present with things, to let the evidence of the world reach them and to respond to it rather than to their assumptions about it." She looked at the fire. Vren would have said something sharp about that. Something like, "You've been here a month and you're writing philosophy." And I would have said, "I nearly died, I'm allowed." And Vren would have said, "You're always nearly dying, it's never made you philosophical before." She closed the record. She thought, "I miss you, Vren." You would have liked him. You would have said something about it that was both true and too funny to let me take seriously, which was always how you handled the things that were most serious. On the 6th day before the retrieval window, she told him about the petition. She had not planned to, she had been keeping it private, which was not an act of deception. She would not have described it that way, but of process, the instinct to complete the formal structure before discussing it, to have something definitive rather than provisional to present. But they were sitting in the evening and the conversation had been moving in the direction of the compact, and she found herself explaining what the petition was and what she had written and why. He listened in the way he listened to everything. When she finished, the silence went on for a longer moment than usual. He said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I know." He said, "You could have just left." She said, "I know that also." He looked at the fire, she looked at the fire. The fire was doing what fires did in the evenings, steady and present, requiring nothing. He said, "What will it change if they reclassify?" She thought about this carefully because it was a good question and deserved precision. She said the planet would become a protected non-contact world first. Compact operations in the sector would not be authorized to interact with or affect the surface population without specific protocol review. The swarm staging ground would be cleared with methods that didn't involve surface bombardment. They would have used it here if the tactical situation had developed differently, she didn't say, but the thought was present. Long-term, if the classification process proceeded through its full arc, it would eventually produce a formal first contact evaluation, which took on average 40 to 60 standard years, and was conducted by specialists in biological and cultural assessment, whose job was to determine the readiness of a precontact species for formal integration